Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Luc Steels. Luc Steels is professor at the Flemish part of Brussels University, and he's also director of the European Center of Sony in Paris. Luc Steels studied computer science and, I guess, electrical engineering at MIT, and language, and this a bit explains his talk today, in Antwerp University. I guess Luc Steels was one of those scientists who influenced me a lot in my ideas of how we can foster complex systems in Europe, a bit like Geoffrey West, who is somewhere in the audience as well. And he was very instrumental in setting up the network of existence, of which he is a science board member. And he's also interested in a couple of projects we have, especially easy agents, which is mentioned somewhere here actually. And I guess I let you start now. This is details, yeah. You want this or you have?
No, I Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming here. I'm very excited to be able to speak here before you. My topic is language. Now, obviously, natural language is an example of a complex system. I mean, it's multi-layered. You know, you have the sounds, you have the words, the morphemes that attach to it. There's the syntax, the grammar. I mean, you have all these layers, and there's complexity or structure, at least, at each of these layers. Most people, you know, they use 40,000, 50,000 words, which have many meanings, which can be combined in many different ways. So it's, at least from a cultural point of view, it's a very complex system. And also, it's a system that is acquired and preserved in a kind of through social-cultural learning. That means it's not something which is there somehow. It's something that has to be built and rebuilt by one generation after another. And another thing which I very much will emphasize in my talk is that the system is changing all the time. Sometimes linguists pretend, or some linguists pretend that, you know, there is the grammar of a language, but actually it's a changing system. And of course you see that from when you look back over centuries of language. I have a slide here. I apologize that it's in French. It's the only slide that will have French. Now this is evolution from Latin to contemporary French. And you can trace this kind of evolution. So I'll just pick on one thing there. Those of you who know Latin will have no problem with the first part. So it basically says, as long as God, and I'll translate directly, knowledge and power me gives. Okay, so scire et posse is knowledge and power, which then becomes changed a bit in the sound of it, and also here savoir et pouvoir. But the thing which I want to point out is this article, le. So in French there were no articles. In fact, in Latin there were no articles either. And they popped up somewhere in this evolution. So it's not just that the language is changing its form and maybe some, you know, word order is changing, because you could see that dat, which is from dare, to give, became, I mean, moved into a second position here, don. So there's kind of changes going on, but it's much more fundamental. There are really innovations taking place in language, like new grammatical categories arising. And of course, there are all the time new words coming up, and words are changing meanings, new sounds coming in. So it's really a system which is changing. Okay. Now, although language is a complex system, and we heard about many other examples of complex systems at this meeting, we almost have no clue about many questions which I believe are very interesting, and I'm sure you do too. And we certainly have no theory. I mean, questions like, how do new meanings arise? It's obvious that the things that people talked about, you know, in the, let's say, Latin period are very different from contemporary period. So, how do new meanings arise? How do these new meanings get expressed? I mean, think about all the concepts around computers, telecommunications, you know, a mouse, the web, uploading, email, all those kinds of things. How do they become expressed into words, expressed into constructs? Now, so this is the creative side. That's what I'm going to be interested in. Then there's also the problem that words spread in populations, grammatical constructions, new sounds, they spread. So how is that happening? There's the question how new sounds may enter. There's also, other kinds of things like clearly language and the way you view the world are related somehow. And so, what is that relation? How does our language influence the way we view reality and, vice versa? There's also the question on the relation to social networks. So, language can shape a network, and of course the network then also determines how language is changing and why it is evolving. So I can go on like that. And if you open up any book on linguistics, there's very few, that these kinds of questions get raised. I mean, most linguists are very busy to describe the phenomena that they see, at least in generative grammar, and they don't worry so much about this evolutionary aspect, the question of origin. Now, obviously, the next question is, can complex systems science help us with answering these questions? And I believe, of course, yes, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And I suppose that the organizers of the conference thought the same thing. Now, the question, of course, is what do we mean by complex system science? And at least for me, there are three things. One of them is that there are a bag of concepts for understanding and building systems. Now, whether this is the stock market or ecosystems, concepts like self-organization, structural coupling, etc., etc. So this, I think, is a kind of rich, set of metaphors which are coming from various sciences and are kind of transmitting to other ones. Now then, there's also a bag of analytical tools that we have. And I think the previous talk, we saw very beautiful examples of this. How you can use tools to analyze the behavior of systems and try to come to grips with it. And almost none of that has been done so far for language or for communication systems. Now, there's a third thing, I think, which is important, is that in this field, a kind of new methodology has developed, which I would call the methodology of artificial systems, which is a bit different from simulations. In the case of simulations, you use a model which you think is realistic, and then you run computer programs, to see whether your model makes the same sort of predictions, and you match it against the data. Now, we are dealing here with systems which are so complicated that we can never imagine that we can put all of this in a model. Now, what we can do is to build systems that show certain phenomena. They are artificial phenomena. We create them. And then we hope that they have some of the properties of the things that we are interested in. So, in our case, as I will show, what we are trying to do is build systems with artificial agents, which are embodied, typically real robots. And we try to see how they can interact with each other, and they have a certain kind of cognitive mechanisms, so that in their interaction, they're inventing language, they're inventing ways of conceptualizing the world, they're negotiating and sharing them. And so we're trying to see what we need to put in order to get artificial communication systems with language-like properties. So this is also what my talk is going to be about. Now, one important thing is that, which I mentioned already, is embodiment. Another feature of language, is that we are talking about the world. We are talking about other people, and so in order to understand, for example, where new meanings come from, we cannot, just have a computer which is sitting on a desk with no connections to the world, no embodiment whatsoever. And so we need to put these systems in environments that have an interaction, rich interactions, and so that those are the ones that can be sources of meaning. Now, I'm just going to show you some slides of the kinds of robots and the kinds of experiments that we've done before we started with language. This is just an illustration. This is already fairly old, from early 90s, and this was an experiment which was inspired by Walter Gray, who's a cybernetician, which some of you may know. And he had this whole idea of building robots that had a charging station like the thing up there. I immediately show these robots at work maybe. So there's a charging station, and there's also competition for the charging station, which are these boxes here. And the robots have to push against the box to make sure there's enough energy in the charging station, because otherwise they would just sit there, do nothing, And so you see here one robot going into the charging station to recharge itself. So we have a little ecology here where the behavior of the robots becomes meaningful from the viewpoint of recharging and self-sufficiency. Now, one thing you see here is another robot also going into this charging station and actually pushing the other one out. Now, people come to our lab and say, take this robot out, he's bad. Which is showing actually, in these kinds of experiments, which are sort of modeled like, biological systems where animals have to work for food and that kind of thing, and to see what kind of relationships will develop, how those robots can learn to cope with the demands of their environment. I'll show another example. This is the humor part of my talk. About the Turing test, perhaps. I think this is a bad test, but the Turing test is invented by Alan Turing, which was this idea that you put a person in a computer, and if you cannot make the difference, then AI has succeeded. Well, I don't think this is a good test. But anyway, we wanted to see whether we could do the Turing test for dogs. Now, just to see what the state of the art in our field was. And so we have here one of the robot dogs is an eyeball. That is a real dog, and a piece of meat in the middle. Now this eyeball is getting interested in this piece of meat. So these are the kinds of experiments that we do in our lab to see how far we are in this kind of... Okay, so back to language. So how do we do this? Well, I mean, it's the same sort of thing, right? We build artificial systems, we put them in partly natural circumstances, and we see what kind of behavior is coming up. And typically, we've settled on what I call the language game approach, which obviously is inspired by Wittgenstein and language philosophers in that line. The idea is basically that we have a population of agents, like the Aibo robots, why not? And they are in an environment, and they take turns playing language games. Now, a language game is typically something which involves an interaction in the world. For example, I could say, do you want some water? I'm sorry. Right. And he doesn't react, but if he said yes, then I would give him water, and etc. Right? So this is a language game because it's about reality, it's about action in reality. I'm doing something, and also I'm using language as part of the interaction, but I need not use language. Now, each of the robots has mechanisms for language use, language invention, and language learning. And we try to see whether we can get artificial languages and also the ontologies. By ontology, I mean it here in a sense that it's now used in computer science. That means the concepts and the objects underlying these languages, that are used to express the meanings. I'll give two brief, one example, which is not yet about meaning, but I will talk about meaning later. This is an example game where we were interested in the sounds of the language. And so we're interested to see how a group of robots could develop a repertoire of sounds that is similar to the sounds of natural language. So we implemented for each robot a kind of articulator, which is like the vocal tract, where you can move, and I'm sorry about the graphics, but you can compute actually a sound by modulating the articulator, which is very much like you move a hand. And then there's the sound, and we also modeled the perception side of it, the hearing side of it. And then put some sort of neural networks between the articulation and perception for categorizing sounds, recognizing sounds, and reproducing them. And so then they play a kind of little game. So, there's first some calling of each other. Well, this is a group, so they first have to get the attention of the other. Now this one starts imitation game. I just lost my mouse here. Starts an imitation game. Goofy. So the agents start out by actually making completely random sounds with their vocal apparatus. This one is hearing and then trying to imitate it. That's an expression of happiness. Okay. Now, well, I kind of presented in a kind of, nice way so that you would not fall asleep. But actually behind it, there's all this machinery of, in this case, neural networks that get initialized. Well, they have to categorize the sounds and then control the articulators. And so we start with networks that are randomly initialized, and then progressively attractors form in the landscape of sounds in their repertoire. So this already gives a hint for people that are into complex systems that many of the ideas actually which have been floating around for describing and understanding systems, that we are using them. And so sounds are viewed as attractors in a potential sound landscape, etc. The other thing we are doing is language games with real robots, and some of it is with the eyeballs like that, which are just engaging with each other and describing things that they see in the world around them. So that's what I will talk about in the coming lecture. Now, I have to perhaps just say briefly that I think the work that we're doing is, of course, trying to get a fundamental understanding of language origins, language evolution, the origins of meaning, that kind of thing. But I feel that it's important for a number of fields, including for economics, and specifically for understanding innovation through conceptual change. And I just put here David Lane from Santa Fe Institute as a pointer. I think also some of the work going on in your group is relevant here. I think also for cognitive science, there's great relevance because traditional ways of viewing at language and linguistics, for example, view it as a fairly static system. And so language clearly is not like that. And I think there's actually a revolution possible in linguistics, also in semiotics, to bring in the concepts of complex systems and get a much more evolving and view of language and meaning. Now, the thing that interests me the most is the impact on information technology. And I believe that if we can make a theory of the sort that I would like, then this can have an impact on actually many things. And the impact is basically that right now, with information technology, there is something that we could call a meaning barrier. I just take a system which was built by Terry Winograd in the 70s at the MIT AI lab. And he built a system with a blocks world, and then he had a dialogue where you could say, pick up a red block, and then you would see on the screen a thing moving, and it would pick up the red block. And then you could ask other questions like, what does the box contain, and things like that. Now, at the time this came out, everybody was amazed, right? Because it seemed that there was language processing, there was reasoning, there was a world model. Maybe artificial intelligence had succeeded. But very soon there was a criticism, and a very famous one is by John Searle. He introduced the metaphor of the Chinese room. And basically his idea is that what these programs are doing is actually They are doing mere symbol processing inside the machine. They're shuffling around symbols. But because they don't have any contact with the real world, they have no way actually to know what they're talking about. And so you have this Chinese room with Chinese people, and then there's Searle who is sitting there. And so what they get, kind of notes with Chinese on it, and then notes going out with Chinese. But Searle says, I could sit in that room and, you know, go through all the motions. But I don't know any Chinese. I'm just shuffling symbols around. And he used that as a metaphor for systems like Schrödinger. Now, I think he was partly wrong in the sense that there are systems that were already built at that time, like Shaky by Nilsson and his group at Stanford Research Institute, who were already grounded in the world. I mean, you could say something like, go to the door, and this robot would move around and actually go to the door. So there was grounding of symbolic representations in the world. But Searle is right, I think, because these symbolic representations, they were programmed in completely. They were not autonomous, developed by the agent itself. They are not open-ended as a consequence. And this is actually a general problem. I mean, if you go on the web, for example, and you type in something, you know, then this big machine was doing all sorts of information processing, symbol shuffling, whatever, comes back to you with pages. But the web knows nothing of what you are inquiring about, you know, except, of course, all these connections. So there seems to be a problem, a basic problem, which is a meaning barrier that all information systems have today, which is how can they autonomously create meaning and ground that into the world. Okay, so now what I would like to do is, first of all, make some comments about language, about verbal communication. And this is sort of the ideas that we are using to build these robotic systems. Then I'm going to give some more details on experiments that we have been doing. Again, I will have to be brief because in the interest of time. And then of course, there's some conclusions. Okay, so first some ideas about communication. Now, well, suppose that you're going with your friend to the movies and it's too far, you want to take a bus. Okay, so you walk on the street. And then there's a bus coming. And then, well, there are two possibilities. Okay, one of the two starts running and the other one starts running after it, and you both hop onto the bus. It could also be that one of the two says, the bus. Both start running, etc. So what is going on here is clearly there's interaction between agents in a particular situation, in a particular context. And we can never forget about that. You know, that's where we have to start. Also, in our robotic experiments, there must be a situation, sharing of attention, common ground, etc., before anything in terms of communication can happen. Now, the communication itself, you have, of course, words like the bus, but you also have an effect like start running. But then in between there are these meanings. And this is, of course, the difficult thing, right? Because we cannot see meanings, we cannot grab them. But it's clear that the connection between what is being said and what is being done somehow has to go through meanings. Now, for the purposes of our research, we adopted a kind of very pragmatic view of what meanings are. And basically, we take it that meanings are distinctions which are relevant for the interaction between the agent and the environment, or between agents among themselves. So they're not Platonic entities or something like that. They are features of the environment relevant for the interaction. For example, you stand before the traffic light, you know, the distinction between red and green is pretty important. Okay. Now, in order to get them to be involved in communication, these meanings somehow have to be recognized. So, you know, we need some sensors, we need networks that do categorization, And so it's only when they can be cognitively recognized that they can actually start to play a role in explicit communication. Now, typically in logic, for example, predicates are the way to denote categories, but I want to avoid confusion between meanings, categories, and predicates. Okay. In the sense, for example, that not all features of the environment which are meaningful to us are actually explicitly recognized by our cognitive system. Okay, back to our bus. Now, the second thing is that when we are saying something, we only make very selectively certain meanings explicit. I mean, in this case, you know, there are lots of things floating around in our shared common situation. You know, like we want to go to the movies, we need to take the bus because otherwise we are late, you know, we need a ticket, etc., etc. But none of that is being said. You know, the only thing which is said is the bus. So that's also very important, and that's of course why it's so difficult for computers to deal with language, is because language is only giving a hint about what you want to say or how you want the other one to act. So there's this very selective. And another thing I would like to say about that is that language is not a code. Unfortunately, the people in complex systems research who are interested in language often assume that is a code. I mean, by that, I have a slide here. In the code, all the information is coded in the message. Whereas in language, you know, it's only very partial information. Also, in a code, the conventions are fixed, whereas in a representation system is much more flexible. Now, language is highly conventionalized, but if you take drawings, you know, things are much less conventionalized. And for a code, you don't need to know who was saying the message. You don't need to know when it was said, whether the person was feeling well, who else was there, etc., etc. You know, you just have the coding mechanism and the rules of the code, and that's it. You can do it. Whereas in the case of representations in general, you need inference, you need common ground. All of these things are necessary. Otherwise, you cannot figure out what is going on. Now, this is a drawing of a child, 4 years old roughly. And what do you think it is? Child playing in the garden, maybe? On the train? Wow, you are too smart. You probably saw it already. But, you know, a garden, some people think a garden, some people think the kitchen, you know. But actually, it is a bus. Now, this is a representation, really. So, it's a bus. A bus is big, right? So, the whole page is filled. A bus has many wheels, you see? It's beautiful, right? And also has many windows. And then there's these big, this is a British bus, obviously. And then there's these big windows at the front. And this is the conductor. You know, and you see, interesting also, the different perspectives that are put on this picture. There's a perspective from the side. There's a perspective from the top, like here, you see from the top of the... There's also the perspective from, you know, with the wheels and the windows, right? So it's inside and out. This is the driver of the bus. I mean, there are many things to say about that, but this is a typical example of a representation. You select things which are important to you. The conductor is clearly very important to this child, right? And you see the hand sticking out to show your ticket. Now, if you don't have a ticket, right? And so it's bringing out what is important. It's putting a perspective on things. You're seeing things from a certain perspective. And of course, then there's the conventions are invented like many wheels, okay? It's a fantastic way to convey that. But it is invented by that child in this particular case. So humans seem to have this incredible ability to invent representations. And in the case of language, it's just an example of that. Even though a lot of it is conventionalized, but you know, children are known to be very creative also in their language. The next observation is that there are important differences in what meanings can or should be made explicit in a language and how. I mean, between different languages. This is something that you start to appreciate if you know many languages, or if you have to shift, like myself, every day between 2-3 languages. I'm just going to give 2 examples of this, but there are many that could be given. This is for time. You might think that time is something, you know, that we all share. It's universal. Everybody thinks about time in the same way. Now, if you start looking at languages, then there are actually enormous differences in how cultures conceptualize time, and also in what they make explicit about time. For example, in, well, tense, like in English, you know, you could say, he came, he come, etc. He will come. So past, present, future. These are tenses. You also have aspect, which is saying where you are in a particular event. Like, is it finished? Is it still going on? Will it have an impact in the future? All that kind of stuff. So these are things that English is bringing out. Now, in Chinese, I cannot read Chinese, but Chinese doesn't have an explicit tense system. So you just have to say, you know, the word Q for go. Well, this is supposed to be a tone, so I can't say that. But, you know, it's always the same word, right? If you want to express the time, you can do it, of course, by saying other words. But the point is that it's not made explicit through tense. That means it's not obligatory. Okay, you cannot do it through the verb. And then in other languages, Kokama is a South American language, you actually have a much more refined system of tense than in English. That means that the distinctions that they make in past and future is more detailed. And so, you know, you can invent many examples. In some languages, like some South American languages, you always need to say, when you say something, where you got the information from. So you could say, I saw it myself, or I heard it from somebody, or I just believe it, but I'm not sure, you know, that kind of thing. And that's showing up in markers like ba and bi and whatever. So in that language, you know, it's obligatory to make that representation. Now, there's of course difference in how, and this is just an example of differences, starting with English, for expressing the relationship between an object and an event. So these are roles, which in German, for example, are expressed with case endings, you know, like den and schweren and so on. In English, it's more with word order and prepositions. It's another interesting example, by the way, because English used to have a case system which was as complex as that of Latin. And it sort of disappeared out of the language and then made the language, forced it to be much more strict in terms of word order and find the replacement with prepositions. Now, this is for Japanese, where they're using particles after the word. And again, it's not just the word form which is different. It's also the way that reality is conceptualized to be able to use these kinds of markers. I had the fortune a few weeks ago to be in Kenya, where there's the Maasai language, which is fascinating from many sides, you know, from anthropological speaking. But in their language, this is a phrase, the woman will get milk for her husband with a cup. And what they're doing actually is the milk, you know, this verb, is repeated a couple of times in the sentence to be able to make constructions in order to express the relationship between, or the roles of the woman and husband and cup, etc., in this kind of construction. So, okay, I think this is enough as examples. Now, there are not only big differences between languages, but there are also differences between individuals in the same language group. And I don't have any slide with data, but I just want to show this graph, which is recording, this is empirical data about the spreading of words, spreading of sounds, spreading of constructions. And of course, this kind of S-shaped curve immediately rings a bell with, you know, to biologists on how spreading of viruses or things like that. Okay, the final thing is that there is all this change in language, and linguists have actually recorded typical examples of steps. So one of them is lexicalization, which means that a new word pops up. Typically, a word is reused with a new meaning in order to express, you know, something that was not expressed before. There's also syntactic structure coming into the language at certain times. For example, word order can be very free at some point, and then the language becomes much more strict in its word order in order to express certain kinds of things. Another phenomena, which I will give an example of, is grammaticalization, which is that basically what happens occasionally is that there is a construction, and this construction is reused for something else, which is maybe new. Now, what typically happens is that the original meaning, they get lost somehow. So they talk about semantic bleaching. That means there's some semantic properties of the original construction are lost, but maybe some new ones are obtained. And there's also typically syntactic change. So there's what is called syntactic bleaching. Some of the original syntactic properties are lost and new ones are gained. Now, an example of English is the following. I mean, the word will used to be a verb of volition. So you could say, for example, I will a book. Now, this may sound very strange to you, but in Dutch, for example, you can perfectly say, ik wil een boek, meaning I want it, right? Or in German, you say, ich wolle ein Buch. It's the same kind of verb stem, where the word will, you know, in Germanic language, really meant I want something. Now, also in French, you can say, je veux un livre. Now, what happened is that if you want something, this is in the future, right? And so, progressively, will became adopted. So the semantic bleaching, it's losing its meaning of volition, and it's becoming more and more expression of future. And so what happened is that you could say, I will do this, you know, I want to do it. You could still there have some sense of volition in it. But then at some point you could say, it will rain tomorrow. And of course nobody wants anything here. Now in French you can definitely not say, il veut pleuvoir demain. So, and another, you know, so it moved from a main verb to a future tense auxiliary. And that kind of evolution you find in many languages. So, you know, new structures are popping up because existing structures are progressively changing due to semantic, syntactic bleaching and taking on new properties. And that's actually how grammar is evolving in languages. So the many examples have been recorded by linguists of these kinds of processes, and they seem to a large extent to be universal properties, even though we don't have any real models of it today. Another thing another example I want to show, and again this is from French, is the negative particle. So, you know, in French you just said at some point, je ne vais, I not go. Okay, just like you would say in any other language, just negation. And the ne was coming from no, Latin. So this, but then at some point people didn't find, you know, that enough as expression of negation. So they started to add something to increase the expressive power, if you want, of what they wanted to say. So they said, for example, je ne vais un pas, meaning I not go one step, literally, you know, a step. Now they had some other words like gut, drop, and things like that, which they were using, or crump, like in crump of bread, you know. So they had several words which were in competition to reinforce the expression of negation. Now at some point, pas won the game. So pas dominated, as the expression of negation. And in fact, now this syntactic bleaching again, it no longer became a noun, became a particle. It lost its article and things like that. And so you have je ne vais pas. Now literally this means I not go step. Or je ne veux pas really means I not one step. Now there's no step anymore involved, right? But it is the word. And actually in modern French what's happening is that the ne is even disappearing. So you could say je veux pas, which means I want step, which means I don't want. But this is the, it's funny because if you take it literally, you see back the history of it. But, those are the things that are happening in language. Sometimes a word can start out in one way and after a few centuries mean just the opposite. Okay, so clearly we are dealing here with cultural evolution. Namely, agents inventing categories, inventing language constructs, reusing constructs for new purposes, and then some of them propagate in the population. So this is the idea of language as a complex adaptive system. It's really like an ecosystem, an ecology, ecology of meanings, ecology of constructs. They're in competition with each other. There's lots of variation, because if you have a big population and some word is invented over there for something, and some other word is invented for the same thing somewhere else, the words are going to spread. There will be competition for a while, and then maybe one will dominate, or maybe there will again be a shift, etc. And so selection is based on a number of forces. One of them is to maximize expressive power. You want to be understood. You want to say what you want to say. So this is something that is a motor. And if you cannot say something, well, you invent something new. And we do that actually all the time. This is a point. Language is not a fixed system that is there and is used, but it's something that is continuously created, recreated, and as a consequence is changing. Now, obviously, you also want to maximize communicative success. And so you want to be precise enough, but not necessarily more precise. You want to minimize the effort, both from the viewpoint of the speaker and from the viewpoint of the listener. And this has many consequences. Minimize effort means, for example, that you want to avoid that the hearer has to do lots of inferences in order to understand what you mean. Because if he has to do that, well, maybe, he's no longer interested to listen to you. And of course, you decrease communicative success. You need to minimize the effort because there's very little time to say something. And you need to push what you want to say in a form that uses minimal amount of material, but enough, again, to remain understood. So these are kinds of forces acting on the system. And of course, it has to be learnable. So you need to, within the language group in which you are, the constructions that you're using have to be such that they can be understood, even if they are new, that they can be learned. So this is sort of the fundamental ideas, that are underlying our computer simulations, our robotic simulations, is these ideas about language, which are very different from, let's say, structuralist ideas about language, where you kind of take it as a fixed system and often as a coding system. Okay, now I would like to give you some idea on some of the experiments that we have done. And yeah, okay. So I'll just see how much detail we have. One experiment that we did on a grand scale is we call the talking heads experiment. And obviously, if you do these experiments with autonomous robots moving around, it's fairly difficult to do a lot of them. So in this experiment, we just used two pan-tilt cameras that were looking at the scene, which is a whiteboard like that. And on the whiteboard, you have various figures that are pasted. And so this is completely open. At any point, somebody can come in and paste a new figure on the whiteboard. Now, this allows us to do a game between two agents, right? And then you can switch roles. One can be speaker and here, and then you can switch roles and they can play a game. The game, I'll explain the game in a minute. Now, we wanted to do experiments with lots of agents. So we built a kind of system where we could have many physical installations where you had a whiteboard and the two cameras. And then the agents were allowed to travel through the internet from one location to another so that, you know, they could come somewhere, play a game, play a couple of games, you know, take turns playing the game, and then teleport themselves to another site and play some games there, etc. And so this way we had a population of a few thousand agents which played in a series of 3-4 months, basically traveled around the world playing, you know, these kinds of language games. Okay, and they played, in total, they played 500,000 language games. Now, what was the game? So we wanted a simple, as simple as possible language game that had all the ingredients, you know, the minimal ingredients to investigate, specifically the origins of a lexicon, and also the origins of the concepts that were expressed in the lexicon. So the agents started out without any language, without any way of categorizing their world, but had to develop this as, you know, as they were playing this game. Now the game is the following. Suppose that there's 3 squares, you know, that are within view. So basically the speaker would move the camera around until it found some interesting scene to talk about. And this could have been one of the scenes. Now the robots didn't have any arms to point, so we used the camera as a pointing device. And one agent could see in which direction the other agent was pointing. This was not very exact, but enough to know a direction. Like if I say, you know, where is the door to go out? And I say, well, there. Now, if you really look, then I'm pointing there, and it's really there. But you see, you know, the pointing was not very exact, but enough to get a sense. Okay. So then the speaker selects one object as the topic, and basically wants to draw attention of the listener to that object. So this is just like if you say, where's the water? And they say, well, there. Okay, that's the game. Now, obviously, if I say, booble-da-boo, well, you don't know what booble-da-boo is, right? But if I say, well, this, hola, this, yeah, booble-da-boo. Okay? So, this is the game they play. I want something. So I have a topic in mind. And I want the listener to pay attention to that, or to give it to me. Now, suppose that the game is failing because the other one does not know the meaning of the word. In that case, we have a little interaction in the world, you know, and I tell you what it is. Now, notice I tell you the object, but I'm not telling you the meanings that I'm using because I cannot communicate meanings. There's no teleportation. There's no sharing of concepts before they start. So, you know, they can only infer possible meanings by going through the world. This is of key importance. Specifically, booble-da-boo, what does it mean? Well, the box of the microphone, the black box, you know, the thing I'm holding in my left hand. These are all possible meanings, right? And so there is no guarantee that the agents will actually share the same meanings. They have to negotiate meanings, and meanings will be they will be related. But it's perfectly possible that you have a time when one, I say booble-da-boo and you think black box, and then I think the holder of the microphone, see? So, and communication could actually succeed for quite a while until there's another black box somewhere, I don't know where, but which is also, I say boo-boo-de-boo, and you say, oh, it's not for the microphone, it must be a black box, that kind of thing. So this is the dynamics that we are going to have in this group of agents. Okay, now I'm going to maybe see how much I will. Okay, so in order to implement such a system, we need to implement for both all the processes that go on both in the speaker and in the hearer for formulating an expression and also for understanding it. So we really, this is not a very simple system that we're dealing here with. I mean, we need machine vision, segmentation, object, event structure recognition. We need ways to conceptualize things. We need structures for representing lexicons, for applying lexicons. We need mechanisms for grammar. So the agents that I'm talking about here are very complex agents. But so there is this complexity, but what is emergent in this system is the lexicons, the grammars, the ontologies that the agents are using. Okay, but I don't want to pretend that they start from nothing. In fact, they start already from complex machinery. Now, in the case of, let me just verbally describe what is going on. So they have to, the speaker, this is the part of the speaker here, has to select a topic. And topic selection will obviously be related to the kinds of interactions that are going on, the social interactions that are relevant. Then there's the conceptualization, which means to find a category, a meaning, which is distinctive. That means is true for the topic, but not for any of the other objects in the environment. And so we assume this kind of principle of relevance here that Dan Sperber and other people have worked on, is to say, you want to find a way, in order to communicate, you want to find, let's say, things which are relevant for your goal of communication. So in this case, you want to find a description that is distinctive for the thing you want to refer to. So if I have these two things here, and I just say cup, well, this is not going to help because there are two cups. So I have to be more precise. Now, if I just have this, don't look at this. I say cup, there's only one, so that's enough in this particular case. So the speaker is actually trying to find a conceptualization of the world in such a way that it would pick out the topic if this conceptualization is applied again to the situation which is there. Now then there's the verbalizations, the process that this conceptualization is translated into language. And well, I don't have much time to go into great detail, but actually the repertoire that an agent has, the inventory, is a set of meaning structures and then a set of forms that are related with it. And so it's an associative memory between meanings and forms, which can be used in both directions. That means if you want to express a meaning, you use this memory to find a form. The form can be as simple as a word, or it can be a grammatical construction of some sort. And if you want to go in the other direction, which you will have to do as lister, then you're looking up in your associative memory, you're looking up bits of a form, putting them together and relating them to the meaning. So in the system, the agents have not just one form for one meaning or one meaning for one form, but they have a memory where you have multiple relations between form and meaning and a score for each of them. So in a certain sense, this is again like a little ecology where there's competition for the expression of a certain meaning, or competition between different forms, between the meanings of different forms. And so what happens is that every time that the agents are speaking, after the game, they are adopting these scores. So if there's a certain meaning needed to be expressed and a certain form is used and it was successful, then the score of that will go up and the score of competitors will go down. So you have a kind of lateral inhibition. And conversely, if there's a form you here and you use a certain meaning successfully to parse and interpret that form, then the score will go up and the score of competitors will go down. So we get a kind of positive feedback loop in the system. Okay, the more a word is used, the more successful it will be, and hence the more it will use, because the agents increase the score and decrease the score of competitors. And after a while, you see a self-organization in the system towards a coherent set of conventions. So I'm just going to skip and show you some graphs here. This is from this Talking Heads experiment. And what the graph is showing is the different words, the frequency with which different words are used in the population for the same meaning. Doesn't matter what meaning it is. So you see here frequency, and you see that in the beginning there's a lot of competition to be able to express that meaning. This is a number of games, and so you see this is 5,000, 10,000, etc. And this is the frequency of the use of the word in the population. And you see that after a while there's a winner-take-all effect. There's one word that will dominate in the population. Not because we programmed it, but due to this positive feedback loop, this word will pop up and dominate. Another effect you see is this one. This is a graph that's showing the different meanings for the same word. And again, you see that typically there are many possible meanings. This goes back to my example of the black box here. If you don't know and you interpret as well as you can, you guess a possible meaning, sort of abduction step, and you assume that is the meaning, but of course, there usually more than one meaning is compatible with the situation. And so you have for a while that all these different meanings float around in the population until perhaps there's a situation that occurs in the world and that causes this kind of choice that only certain meanings are left and other meanings disappear. This is an example to show that you see this kind of S-shaped curve that I was talking about. This is for in population, showing for different population sizes how long it takes the agents to bootstrap from scratch a convention set, a lexicon in this population. And obviously, the more agents you have, the longer it will take before they reach coherence. I just showed this one also. Unfortunately, the colors are not so good, but to show the kinds of games you can play now. It's a bit like in the traffic examples that we've seen, where you simulate a whole city, right, with all the traffic and energy and things like that. So here we can start playing games where we have populations of agents, and we can do various things to it, like change population flow, take some agents out, put some agents in, see whether the system remains stable, under what conditions it is doing that. Also, when we introduce like noise in their perception of a word or errors in the production of a word, is that having an impact on the stability of the communication system? All those kinds of games that people used to play with, chemical reactions, or we can do actually now with these language systems. And this is an example to show under what conditions there would be lexical evolution. We start here with a closed system, that means a group of agents which very quickly get 100% success in communication. Then we change one agent every 100 games, which has actually no impact because the new agent is quickly learning the language which is already in the population, although sometimes there's a new word being made. And here we introduce that a word is not always heard in the right way or pronounced in the right way. So you start getting you know, bagi, dagi, pagi, kagi, and you know, there's all sorts of things are happening here until there's one word here, kuzi, which is dominating again in the population and becoming the new word as an evolution from bagi there. Wow. Okay, this is about grammar, but I'll skip that. Okay, do we have time for 3 minutes? No time? Well, I would like to close with one more example maybe of you know, the experiments that we do. And this is to show this is now an experiment between human and robots. And so obviously we do lots of this with populations of robots among themselves. My suggestion for the Mars exploration is actually to send a group of robots there who have this kind of capability to invent their own language as they walk around, and so that they can talk about new experiences on Mars for which we don't have any words, right? Okay, but we also do experiments in communication between humans and robots, because people say, well, this is all good that these robots speak their own language, but we don't understand a word of it. Okay, this is again with the eyeball. And this is through the eye of the eyeball, what the objects in the world. So we bought some objects for it, a ball, and there's something called smiley, and some other things. Now, the important thing is that a ball, for example, you might think a ball is an easy thing to recognize. Actually, if you look through the eye of a robot, a ball is something extraordinarily complicated. I mean, these are all images of the ball. Now, you see that almost none of them is a nice sphere. And just to do segmentation is an extremely difficult problem. I blew up the pixels, you know, just on the edge of that image there of the ball, you know, and you see how difficult it is. So the way that in this experiment that I will now show, the eyeball actually has to learn the concept of ball at the same time as it is learning the word for ball. And so this is the idea that learning about language is very much also learning concepts that are used in the culture to deal with the world. And we use here a kind of memory-based approach, as they say in computer vision. That means we take, like, the eyeball is taking different views of the object in different contexts, and that way building up a kind of visual memory of what balls look like in certain contexts. And so the robot is playing a game with a human, and there's two games. There's a look game, you know, where the experimenter is, you know, saying, look, you know, a ball, things like that, and the robot is attempting to learn the ball. Now, in the video clip that I will show, there are two things important. One is that the shared attention, this is the difficult thing. How can you, you know, get in contact? How can you know what the robot is looking at, and how can the robot know what you are paying attention to? So this, I think, is an important bottleneck in this interaction. The second thing is also that the robot already learned a word for smiley. And so the first time it sees the ball, it thinks this is smiley because that's the thing which is closest to it, okay? And so then you will see the feedback and saying, no, no, this is not smiley, but this is ball, right? Okay, so now we let this video, this is the final, doesn't want to do it. This is the final slide I want to show.
Down.
Sit down.
Sit down. Good. What is it? What is it? What is it?
Smiley.
No.
Smile.
Back. Bad. Listen. Ball.
What is it?
Ball.
What is it?
Ball.
Ball.
Yes. Good.
Now a little test.
Good.
Ball. Okay.
Okay, so that's the end of my talk. So I think, you know, as everybody else, there's an enormous amount of things which remains to be done, particularly in the domain of grammar, although that's my focus at the moment. I should also point out that there's enormous opportunities for theoretical work in complex systems because the mathematical foundations for all this are almost completely lacking. You know, we're focusing a lot now on building systems. And finally, a lot of application areas. I focused on robots, but, you know, I think there's much wider application areas, and they're also totally unexplored. Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much for this very nice talk, which shows the kind of science I guess we should fund. It's sort of following Brian Arthur. It's generative understanding, where you can get something out of it, out of the understanding for example, information technologies. I guess perhaps we have one question, and then we have the other questions after the last talk. Is there one question?
What about the case when the words are not describing a state of the world, but are building type abstractions or not to the level of language, like the concept of habit?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is a very good question. I mean, we are focusing at the moment on, let's say, visual categories, embodied concepts, that kind of thing. And I mean, one thing which happens in language is that these more abstract notions are typically, by metaphor and analogy, extracted from, you know, more bodily and sensory motor, you know, interactions. But of course, I mean, there might be a temptation to kind of implement all sorts of things in it, but I think if you want to do something like happiness, then the first question is, what does it mean for a robot to be happy? You know, we shouldn't pretend that the robot is happy just by putting in a symbol, because then we go back to this Chinese room complaint, right? Rightfully. So there's a question, what does it mean for a robot to be happy? I have a paper on this, which I can send you. But I mean, that's not yet what we are doing. And, well, that's open, which remains to be done.